Hi, welcome to the TC. My name's David, and today we're going to be taking a look at the iPhone 16 Pro Max and my experience of using it since launch. Arguably, with one of the most major features marketed for the iPhone 16 series still not here, that being Apple Intelligence, how has my thoughts on the 16 Pro Max changed over the course of the year that I've owned it? Well, let's find that out today. So first, I want to talk about the design of the iPhone 16 Pro Max. There's four different colors that you can choose from. There's black, white, desert, and a natural titanium color. And pretty much these are very similar to the colors that we had on the 15 Pro series. Obviously, the new edition is the desert option. And it's kind of like a blush gold, but still not quite gold. I do wish that there was more colorful options for the 16 Pro series, especially since the regular 16 series had quite a lot of different colors. And honestly, some of my favorite colors on that are probably the ultramarine and teal colors. If they did have that for the Pro options, I probably would have gone with one of those colors. So one of the biggest standout features with the 16 Pro Max, in my opinion, is definitely the screen size. They bumped it up to 6.9 inches over the 6.7 inches of the previous iPhones. And even though it's not a huge difference, I think that having the super thin bezels really makes a difference in terms of how modern the phone looks. And even when you put this side by side next to something like a 13 Pro Max, you can definitely see a huge difference with those bezel sizes. And because it does have those really thin bezels, I think that this phone will age pretty well in terms of the front screen. And of course, like the 15 Pro series, titanium makes a return on the 16 Pro series. Now, this is rumored to go away with the 17 series, but I guess we'll have to wait and see how that looks like. Overall, though, I do think that the titanium railing on the 16 Pro is really nice. It does make the phone feel quite a bit lighter than stainless steel railings that we had in previous Pro iPhones, and it actually matches my Ultra. I don't really have any durability concerns with the titanium as well. Like I said, I do have an Ultra, and honestly, I've been wearing it for 2 years, and it's hit against things and dented other things, and it still looks brand new today. So even the 16 Pro Max with the titanium edges still looks brand new today. If anything, it actually might look better over time versus the stainless steel, which is easier to scratch. So now, even though it does have the titanium and it is lighter than the previous Pro iPhones, it still is a pretty big phone. And I'm talking about the Pro Max version. It's a pretty large phone. And if you aren't used to having larger phones, this phone is actually larger than the 15 Pro Max. And yeah, you definitely feel that. The in-hand feel of the 16 Pro Max, though, is pretty similar to previous Pro Max iPhones, albeit a little bit larger. So I don't think that most people would have any problems using the 16 Pro Max. On the front is also the dynamic island. If you remember, this was introduced with the 14 Pro series. And yeah, I mean, I kind of do like the functionality that it brings instead of just being kind of like a useless cutout. Honestly, I don't know if this is something that's going to stay with future iPhones. There's rumors that they might be kicking it out. But as it is right now, the dynamic island is a pretty useful tool and a workaround for something that is essentially just a cutout on the display. Now, one of the major hardware changes to the 16 series as a whole has also been the camera control button. Now, this is a bit of a controversial button. Some people like it, some people don't. I'm kind of on the fence about it. I really do like having the quick access to the camera, but over time, I found myself using the button less and less because it is pretty hard to press. But I'll talk more about that on the camera section of this review. Of course, there's also USB-C on the bottom of this phone, and it does support up to USB 3 transfer speeds. I kind of wish that they did have Thunderbolt, but having the USB 3 transfer speeds does mean that you can record straight onto an SSD like I'm doing right now, actually. Overall, though, I really do appreciate the thinner bezels and the lighter design of the 16 series, and I think that it will age pretty well. It is kind of funny, though, thinking about this phone aging because the design of the iPhone 16 Pro Max is pretty derivative all the way from the iPhone 12 Pro Max. And honestly, I don't know, is that a bad thing or a good thing? In one case, it's the last generation probably of this iPhone design, so it should be the most reliable. But at the same time, it is starting to feel pretty dated. And yeah, I think it is time for a change. And of course, those changes are probably going to be coming with the 17 series. And I think Apple knows that this design is getting kind of old, especially with rumors like the iPhone 17 Air. I think that this iPhone, even though it has this older design, it will still age pretty gracefully just because this design has stuck around for such a long time. It's going to be interesting to see how the 17 series looks different compared to this phone, and there's already a bunch of mixed feelings about the new design. As a whole, though, the 16 Pro series is probably going to be the last iPhone series since the 12 to feature this design, so keep that in mind. So now let's talk about the performance of the iPhone 16 Pro Max. So the 16 Pro series uses the A18 chip, and this is the A18 Pro chip. It's a little bit different from the regular A18 chip, being that it has an extra GPU core. Now, this GPU core allows for faster graphics rendering, better ray tracing, and Apple claims that it's 2 times faster than the iPhone 15 Pro series. So, what does this really translate to, though, in real life? Well, in my experience using the iPhone 16 Pro Max, I've never really felt there was a moment where it was a slow phone. And I mean, that can be said, though, for pretty much every modern iPhone. However, one of the biggest problems with the 15 Pro series was thermal throttling. And I think that the bigger design and just a better overall cooling structure on the iPhone 16 Pro series has helped that issue not become as prevalent as it once was. Essentially, I do see this as being kind of a future proofing for the next 4, 5, 6, maybe even 7 years. If you benchmark this iPhone, and I know benchmarking isn't really going to be a true translation for how it is in real life performance, but it does give us some sort of, benchmark as to where this processor does place itself. And it's really similar actually to the M1 chip, and it even surpasses it in some circumstances. So I think that's really awesome actually. The fact that we have desktop class performance coming out of a smartphone is actually super impressive. Now that the A18 does have that performance, Apple is actually rumored to be making a low-cost MacBook using the same chip that's in the 16 series. And I could definitely see that being a thing, just because the performance on this chip is really close to my iPad Pro. And that's a compliment, honestly. I wouldn't have thought that something this small could have that much performance. But because it does have that much performance, it does also mean that it can heat up. And I know that I mentioned that it doesn't heat up as much as the 15 Pro series, but that doesn't mean that this phone doesn't heat up at all. If you're doing really intensive tasks such as raw photo editing or just video editing, this phone can heat up pretty quickly. However, I did notice that it does cool down pretty fast as well. Another thing to mention too is that the phone only does have 8 gigabytes of RAM. Now, this might become an issue later on in the future when apps use more RAM, and I kind of do wish Apple had just put at least 12 gigabytes or even 16 would have been amazing, but we are stuck with 8 gigabytes of RAM on the 16 Pro series. Next, let's talk about the camera system on the 16 Pro Max. So, like previous iPhones, the 16 Pro Max features a triple camera setup, and this has been around basically since the 11 Pro series. However, the cameras on the 16 Pro are upgraded from the 15 Pro. You're likely to see pretty similar photos from the 15 Pro, albeit with different processing. The sensor readout on the main camera of the iPhone 16 Pro Max is quite a bit faster than what we had with the previous Pro iPhones. And what does that mean? Well, you get photos that come out a lot faster when you press the shutter button versus the previous iPhones. And coming from someone who uses an actual camera, I really love this addition. Before, when you press your shutter button, there'd be a tiny bit of lag between taking the photo and actually having the photo being taken. But now, when you press the shutter button on the iPhone, it takes the photo instantaneously. It is still a 48 megapixel sensor though, so the actual sensor quality is pretty similar to what you're going to be getting on the 15 Pro series. I do think that this camera sensor actually provides quite a bit of detail when you're using it in ProRAW or on a separate app such as Adobe's beta app Indigo. For the telephoto camera, we're basically transplanting the same telephoto camera that was in the 15 Pro Max, and I don't really see this being a negative. However, I will say that being only 12 megapixels does kind of ding it when it comes to camera quality. It's probably the weakest camera on the iPhone 16 Pro Max. However, having that 105 millimeter equivalent does mean that you can zoom in pretty far. Now, you're not going to be breaking any records, especially since some companies such as Samsung have much farther zooms. However, I do feel like 105 millimeters is a pretty good compromise for having a zoom that is able to shoot far away, but also not so far that you're so zoomed in when you're using it. I will say though that Apple's processing on the telephoto camera is a bit lackluster. It does seem to kind of muddy the photos by trying to introduce more detail using AI or some sort of on-device processing. If you use another app such as Adobe's Project Indigo, then you can get a more kind of realistic view out of the telephoto camera. And honestly, the telephoto camera wasn't my favorite camera to use on the 16 Pro Max before, but after using it with Indigo, I do see a massive improvement to detail and just overall look over using it on Apple's own camera app. When you process the raw files, you're able to get a lot more detail out of them, and it just looks a lot more realistic with better lighting and just overall detail. Now, of course, there is more noise, but I think I would rather trade off noise for detail. This was also the first time that Apple has upgraded the ultra-wide camera for a long time, honestly. There's now a 48 megapixel sensor, so you do get quite a bit more detail, especially when you're using something like macro mode. Previously, with the 12 megapixel ultra-wide cameras on the older iPhones, it would crop in that sensor to be able to get that macro shot. But because you're cropping a 12 megapixel sensor, it did mean that the photos were pretty muddy and grainy and just not very detailed. But now you can get very detailed photos out of the ultra-wide camera on the 60 Pro Max, being that it is 48 megapixels. But I would still adjust your expectations out of this 48 megapixel sensor. It's still not the best sensor. And honestly, if you're looking at it really closely, you're going to notice that there isn't quite that much detail as you might expect. Now, of course, if you're using ProRAW, then you can extract a little bit more detail, but it's still not quite to the same quality as you're going to get out of the main sensor. There's also still the LiDAR sensor on the back for better portrait mode, as well as the same flash unit we've had since the 14 Pro. On the front of the phone, you're still getting the same camera that we had on the 15 Pro. It's a 12 megapixel sensor with autofocus, and honestly, it's fine for what it is, but I can definitely see Apple upgrading this camera sensor in the future. Even something like 24 megapixels would make a huge difference as to how this camera looks. And I think it could definitely use more detail. Now, of course, one of the biggest features of the 16 series is camera control. And this new button is kind of weird. Now, it's a button, but it also has a half press feature as well. And the half press feature uses the haptic motors to simulate a button. And I just kind of wish Apple had just used the haptic motors to simulate the button for both a half press and a full press, just because the actual actuation of the button is actually pretty difficult to do. It requires a lot more force than you might expect. This in turn can introduce a lot of camera shake when you're taking photos using the button versus just pressing on the screen shutter. And I'm not really sure why Apple made the button so difficult to press. The only thing I can think of is that they were worried about people accidentally pressing it. But if it was a haptic button, I feel like it would have still been way easier to actually use the button. Speaking of the half press, if you do a half press on the camera control button, it does allow you to use a menu that configures different settings for the camera, such as zoom or just kind of different colors or moods, as Apple calls it. And I'll get more on that later. But essentially, it's just different controls. It's the same controls that you'll have on screen, but you can use the button to activate them instead. Now, is it faster than just using the on-screen buttons? No, it's really not. But is it more fun and engaging to use than those on-screen buttons? Think I would argue yes. I think that this is honestly a feature that a lot of people who've owned the 16 series have probably used a lot once they first got the phone, but kind of forgotten about it over time. And I could see that really being the case for the camera control button. It's a really great tool for accessing your camera really quickly, but I don't really see any functionality beyond that. Other than that, doing a long press of the camera control button does allow you to use visual search, and well, it's just visual search. So it's going to have kind of sparing uses. There's also a major overhaul for the photographic styles. And I think that this was one of the biggest things that people were excited about, just because smartphone photos have really become pretty smartphony. If you know what I mean, basically it makes every photo seem pretty flat by raising the shadows and crushing the highlights. And honestly, I really wish there was more control over how our photos look. And I think Apple took that and really answered a lot of the problems that people were having with the iPhone camera being too artificial. With the photographic styles, you have different controls for undertones and mood. And undertones essentially allows you to manipulate the color temperature as well as how much the artificial processing is being placed onto your photos, while moods are more like a film simulation. So when you do get an iPhone 16 or 16 Pro, you can set an undertone and kind of preset how you want your photos to look every time. And from there, that's how your photos will look. What's great about it though, is that they're not permanently in that photo. So you can actually edit the photo and manipulate how the colors and tone of that photo will look. So now you can have photos that don't look as artificial as previous iPhones. And I think that's a huger bonus to the 16 Pro series over the previous iPhones. Now, moods, they're more like film simulations. And I think that they included this because film simulations are becoming pretty popular and a lot of people want a more nostalgic look. And I think it is a good addition. However, I wish that there was more moods to choose from. I really thought that in iOS 26 they were going to put in some extra moods. However, there isn't any extra one. So maybe in the future we'll get some extra moods to choose from, but as it is right now, there are only a select few. So that's pretty much everything on the photo sides of things. Now let's talk about video. For the first time, the iPhone's able to shoot 4K video at 120 frames per second, and it's something that I've been wishing for a pretty long time. Because the main camera sensor has a faster readout speed, it allows for this feature. And honestly, the videos coming out at 4K and 120 frames per second look pretty good. However, even regular video looks pretty good, albeit still having that smartphone look. If you don't want that smartphone look though, Apple does have Apple ProRes and log functionality. I'm actually recording on my 16 Pro Max right now in log, and hopefully you guys can see a difference in quality versus just regular video. However, to be able to do this though, I actually have it connected to an external SSD because the amount of space that ProRes log takes is enormous. And even with my 1 terabyte SSD and about half of it filled up right now, I'm only able to record up to 70 minutes. And that's just kind of insane. So I could definitely see that being a pretty huge inconvenience to a lot of people. Now, I do wonder if Apple will be doing something like a filmic styles, similar to the photographic styles, just because I do think that that's something that a lot of people might be interested in using over just having regular looking footage. Maybe that's something they'll introduce with the future iPhone, but I really wish that was something that could also be done on current iPhones. One of the biggest additions as well was the new microphones that are now studio quality. And you do have this new feature called Audio Mix that allows you to manipulate how the audio sounds coming out of it. There's different settings. You can have it where it kind of deletes the sound around you. And I think that's useful for like vlogging, but it does still sound kind of artificial. I will say that the microphones on the 60 Pro Max though are significantly better than previous iPhones. Even when I've gone to like concerts, the recording quality on these microphones are so much better. They don't really hit a peak, and that's a huge difference for me. So that's pretty much it for the camera system on the 16 Pro Max. Do you guys have a 16 Pro Max and love using the camera? I'd love to hear in the comments down below of your experience with it. Next, I want to talk about the speakers. Now, the speakers actually punch way above what you might expect. The speakers actually get properly loud on this phone, and in a lot of ways, I never really have to have it at 100%, whereas previous iPhones, I would. And that's a huge difference for me. They're a lot more punchy and bassy and just sound a lot more full. And that was kind of surprising to me. I wasn't really expecting a huge difference in speaker quality, but there actually is. There's a little bit of distortion once you hit them at 100%, but like I said, you're not really going to need to put them at 100% anyway. So next, I want to talk about battery life and connectivity of the iPhone 16 Pro Max. The battery life on the 16 Pro Max is rated for 4 more hours over the 15 Pro Max in video playback, and honestly, this does translate to a pretty big difference in terms of battery longevity. Even a year later, I'm able to get through my day pretty easily without having to worry about battery. It's enough to actually make it so that I've actually set my phone to charge limit at 80% just to increase the health and see how far can I let it go? And honestly, even at 80%, I'm still able to get through my day perfectly fine. Now, of course, that's going to depend on your usage and how much you use your phone. But for me, 80% has been a pretty good gap in between battery life as well as just saving my battery health for times that I really need it to be charged to 100%. And even then, even with all my cycles on my battery health is still at 100%. So if that's saying something, I think that means that the battery on the 16 Pro Max is very good. On a physical connection standpoint, the iPhone 16 Pro series as a whole, of course, has USB-C, and it is USB 3.0. Now, what's pretty dumb though is that the regular 16s only have USB 2.0, and it's 2025, and really there should be USB 3.0 or even Thunderbolt across the board. This does mean though that you do get pretty good transfer speeds on the Pro series iPhones, and of course you're going to need it if you're recording those pretty lengthy videos in log anyway. There's also faster charging on MagSafe up to 25 watts, and I would say that it is pretty useful. This phone actually charges way faster than I was expecting. And yeah, mix that with the charge limit, and honestly, you can get up to 80% very quickly. So some final thoughts I have with the iPhone 16 Pro Max. It's a good iPhone, but it definitely feels iterative and incomplete as it stands currently. It's really weird for Apple to be pushing a feature like Apple Intelligence as hard as they did, considering it wasn't really even out yet when this phone was released. They've been kind of spoon feeding us different features from Apple Intelligence, but the major feature, that being the Siri overall, isn't coming until 2026. And missing that deadline for 2025 does mean to me that Apple kind of rushed this whole product as a whole. Now, I didn't buy the 16 Pro solely for Apple Intelligence, and honestly, it's probably a good thing I didn't, just because pretty much all those Apple Intelligence features have been kind of, well, meh. If anything, I don't think that Apple should have been advertising this phone or any of their products being built for Apple Intelligence, especially considering a lot of the major features still aren't here. And because of this, I would consider the iPhone 16 Pro series more like an iPhone 15 Pro S. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. Most people with smartphones today are keeping them for a much longer amount of time. And honestly, you can. These smartphones have kind of hit a peak in terms of design as well as usability. And even though things get older over time, really the only thing that's going to age badly is probably battery life. And that's something that you can change yourself or have changed. Now, I don't think that smartphones are something that you need to upgrade every year or two, or maybe even three. It's honestly something that you can keep for 4 or more years. And where this iPhone stands, I think they're targeting more towards the 11 and 12 series people. And as it is a pretty good upgrade from those phones. And even when the 17 series comes out, I don't think that it's going to be a huge difference from the 16 series. And that's not a bad thing. If anything, I do think that the design of the iPhone has become pretty stagnant. And that's where they really need to do improvements on. And that's where they're going to be doing a lot of the changes rumored for the iPhone 17 series. So we're probably going to see a major overhaul in design. But as it is right now, the 16 Pro is essentially just an evolution of the same design that we've had for many years. I think that's why the rumors of something like an iPhone 17 Air are actually really exciting, because it marks the first time in pretty much like a decade almost that we've had a major redesign for an iPhone. And of course, we don't know if this is actually going to be true or not, but as it stands right now, I think that that's something that I'm pretty excited to see where it goes. Something like the iPhone mini, for example, was a chance that Apple took. And even though it kind of flopped, I still think that it was a pretty worthwhile chance to take. Obviously, the iPhone mini does have a pretty big cult following. However, it still didn't sell like Apple thought it would. And sometimes you have to make decisions that aren't the best, just because I feel like the market as it is pretty stagnant when it comes to smartphones. And when you look at the competitors, especially Samsung over here with their folding phones, I think those generate quite a bit of buzz because they are different. And I think that the whole update to iOS 26 is a pretty big distraction from the fact that iPhones haven't really changed all that much since, I don't know, maybe 2019. I will say though, I do think that this iPhone was actually supposed to release with the whole liquid glass redesign of iOS 26, especially since the wallpapers on it seem to be pretty inspired from liquid glass. But because Apple Intelligence was something that they were trying to push out just to show that they had AI features, they had to put it on a backlog instead. But how does iOS 18 run on the iPhone 16 Pro Max? Obviously, this phone was made with iOS 18 in mind, so it does run pretty well. But there are still a few bugs with iOS 18 that I'm kind of annoyed they haven't been fixed. One of the bugs I'm dealing with is this weird issue where the screen just doesn't turn on. If I'm pressing the side button or tapping the screen or lifting the phone, it will take like 5 to 10 seconds to turn on. It's a little bit sporadic. It only happens sometimes, but still, it's a weird bug. And I've had that bug now for a couple months, and I'm not really sure why it hasn't been fixed. It could be a hardware problem, but I'll wait and see after iOS 26. If I continue having that bug, then I'll take my phone in and see if I can get it replaced, because that is super annoying. Also, when I first got the phone, touch on the left top side wasn't super accurate and it wouldn't work all the time when you're trying to swipe down for notifications. And this ended up being a software glitch. So that's why I'm thinking that the other bug I have might just be a software bug as well. So all of this compounds down to one question essentially. Was the iPhone 16 Pro Max worth it? I believe that in my case, yeah, it was. I came from an iPhone 13 Pro Max, and even though that isn't a super old iPhone, there was some things about it that I just really wanted to have a change with. Most notably, battery life and connectivity. The battery life on my 13 Pro Max was pretty bad, especially since the battery health has degraded quite a bit. But also, Using Lightning was becoming pretty annoying for me, especially since all of my other devices are USB-C already. So having to lug around another cord just for my phone was getting kind of old. Even if I had gotten a battery replacement for my 13 Pro Max, I still think it would have been annoying for me to have to lug around a Lightning cord. And yeah, maybe that's a first world problem, but hey, for me, I feel like all the upgrades on the 16 Pro Max still were beneficial to all the use cases that I have for it. I believe that a lot of the people going to the 16 Pro series coming from older iPhones would have had a pretty good experience with this new iPhone. And even though it is pretty inspired from the older iPhones, a lot of the internal upgrades, especially upgrades to the camera, make a pretty huge difference in terms of how it feels to use, as well as how good it is of a smartphone. So that's it. That's the iPhone 16 Pro Max. If you made it this far, thanks a lot for watching. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to see more content just like this. And let me know in the comments down below if you guys have bought an iPhone 16 Pro Max or 16 Pro or any of the 16 series. I'd love to hear about your experience using it down in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.